I want to start by saying, earlier today I had a conversation with somebody and it really reconnected me with the fact that we're in interesting times, in extraordinary times. And I want to ask all of you, not to discuss it right now, but I want to ask you if you've had a conversation in your last few days here in the conference, or maybe sometime before coming to the festival, that's kind of reconnected you with that understanding, with that shivers down your spine, and you say, we're in amazing times. And so what I want you to do is think of that moment just for a few seconds, and I want you to hold that feeling that came over you when you realized, wow, it's now, it's happening, it's really changing. Okay, so I said that's the backdrop. I'll give you a minute with that. Those extraordinary times are the backdrop of the discussion that I want to have. And what I'm going to be looking at is really two different things. There's the features of the new economy, and then there's these kind of sleeping giants where the new economy, one of these features is so big, it's so powerful, it's awakening, and it's got the power to create a kind of shift change in our economy that will have repercussions in the way that we relate to our environment, to our community, etc., etc. So I want to present these kind of sleeping giants throughout this presentation, and I also want to use the collective wisdom of the group to try and work out when the tipping point is. When will we cross a threshold that then becomes unstoppable? So just to give you an example of tipping points, when we think of climate change, can anybody tell me about a kind of tipping point for climate change? Brilliant, which is a really good one, actually. And can anyone tell me what? I'll go on to talk about the permafrost, for example, in Serbia, I believe, where there's so much methane locked in there that if we go past that 400 parts per million, we have a kind of sequence of events that creates a slightly warmer temperature by maybe 2 degrees, that then releases this massive quantity of methane that sets off a chain of events that just keeps looping backwards into, feeding into the growth of diverse weather, climate change disasters, essentially. But what's really important about this kind of the time frames that we're talking about, the 400 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere, was actually something we didn't really, there was no fanfare. It wasn't a major event. It wasn't the release of the methane that was a tipping point. It was something that happened quietly years beforehand. And actually, when the methane releases, there's still another 30 years before that major event becomes a kind of major catastrophe, before that feeds into kind of the climate loops. So when we're thinking about tipping points, it's important to think that they could be happening as we speak. They're just not happening with these major fanfares and super big events. So I want to kind of put it back to you again now. The features of the new economy are all being lived and experimented with in this festival. This is a microcosm of the new economy, and for many reasons it might be working or it might not be working. I don't really want to get into that kind of debate, but I want to hope that some of you can just give me a few words, to describe a feature of a new economy. Maybe you see it here, maybe you see it somewhere else. So what are the features of the new economy? Has anybody got a couple of words that they can put into that? Brilliant. It's a starting point. Take what you need and give what... I'm going to repeat them. Oh, go on, no, you've got the microphone. That's great. The first one was a kind of zero economic growth. And I would go as far to say even degrowth. Beyond that would be, a transitional thing would be to reach zero growth, and then degrowth would be a further aspiration after that. And then the second one was take what you need, give what you can. Any others? Working in smaller communities. I think I'm going to working in smaller communities, kind of localization, that kind of stuff. Community spirit. Fair shares. So that's kind of like it's a farming technique, isn't it? A way of investing in it. Is it not?
Fair share, so everyone has what they need.
Right, fair play, like equity in a way, kind of. Yeah. Any more? Crowdfunding, brilliant, yes.
Changing values.
Changing values, yeah, kind of shift. Brilliant.
Poverty eradication.
Hallelujah, that would be an amazing thing, yes. The end of poverty. One thing that I experienced here during the conference was a lot of giving. That's something that I'd like to bring into that discussion as well in terms of features of the new economy. Anything else? Yeah, absolutely. New money, new ways of trading, that kind of stuff. Absolutely.
Less ownership and more sharing?
Hallelujah, yeah. And we're seeing quite an upsurge in community ownership and, yeah, collectively owning or owning things. Brilliant, yeah. What he said? Responsibility for externalities. Taking responsibility. Any more for any more?
Closing the loop of resources.
Closing, yeah, absolutely. A key feature of the new economy. So, right, just to wrap it up, because there's quite a few of these, and actually there are a lot. You know, we could do 20 or 30 of these kinds of things. But just to wrap it up, one or two of these, maybe three of these things that you've just mentioned are sleeping giants. They're waiting to awake, and when they do, they're going to feed back and kick off all the others. And you won't be able to stop it once you start it. And that's the kind of hypothesis that I'm going to put forward. The reason that this is so important is because we have to start reimagining another world. Yeah, we have to start creating a new story in our brains. And for me personally, that story has to be rooted in reality. We have to root it in some sort of practical stuff that we know is happening, and that we can see if it was slightly larger, the world would be an amazing place. Rather than these kind of visions where it's all dreamy and that kind of stuff, it doesn't really work for me. I need something practical and grounded, and I can say, yeah, I can see that working. So reimagining the future is an amazingly important thing, but also, why should we do it in economic terms? You know, for me, over the last 18 months, I've been working on a project with the Transition Network, and economics has become growing and growing in terms of its relevance to me. It was all green for me previously. It was all about, you know, the stuff that the environment, all of that kind of stuff. And I was trying to change my house and rebuild, you know, so it was insulated, all of these kind of things. But then I realised that we're on this economic juggernaut. That if we just make that juggernaut green, it's still going over the cliff. And if we just make it slightly more ethical, the way that the profit-driven kind of economic growth juggernaut works is it just kind of finds a way around the ethics and, you know, always manipulates it, so it kind of turns it on its head. So we've actually got to create an economy that actually the ethics and being green is just a natural byproduct of it. We really need to get the roots of the economy working, so the rest just naturally feeds off it, regenerates, it kind of restores, it revitalizes our communities, our biodiversity, etc., etc. So the economy is core to that vision of another world. So just quickly to introduce myself, that's what I'm going to be talking about, but to quickly introduce myself, I spent 10 years traveling around the world as an event organizer, and the thing that I did, which has had the biggest impact, was an event for tens of thousands of people in the middle of the Amazon. And it was the first time that Greenpeace and the state governor of the Amazon shook hands and said, should we preserve this bit over here? And then they were having those kind of conversations. The first time they weren't beating each other up, essentially, and trying to shoot each other, or the government trying to shoot the Greenpeace people. And so, and then I came back to the UK, and I've spent the last 10 years as a kind of social entrepreneur, a bit of a consultant, that kind of stuff. But in recent times, I've been working with the Transition Network on something called Re-Conomy Project. Does everybody know the Transition Network, or is it something that I need to introduce? Introduce it, okay. So the Transition Network started in 2006 and now has around 1,000 official communities. It's not got a doctrine as such, the Transition Network. The communities just work out the best way to change their communities at a community level. They come with the principle of, on my own I can't do enough, the government's not going to do it quick enough or deep enough, but if we work collectively as a community, we can make a transition on a level that's relevant to us, which is our community level. And so these communities have spread up all over the world. And what's happened to these communities is they've reached a point now, they set up projects about food growing, they set up projects about transport or waste, and these projects are starting to evolve into businesses now. People are saying, actually we're doing it, but it could be an enterprise. I can see an opportunity here to make this into a business. And so on one level, the transition communities all over the globe are starting to need this understanding. And what we do with the Re-Conomy Project is share these ideas around. We say, those guys down in Somerset did an amazing model. Here's the format, go for that if you want to replicate it. And we kind of connect people up with their new enterprises. But there's also another thing, you know, the Transition Network used to say we're responding to peak oil and climate change, but there was a realization that we have to be responding to a failed economic system as well. And so that was bringing that, so Re-Conomy Project brings that into it as well. And one of the things that I particularly like about Re-Conomy Project is that it brings a kind of spirit of the entrepreneur into the Transition Network. Sometimes the Transition Network is labelled with this kind of regressionary, you want to go back to living in caves, that's what you're all about. But I like the fact that this Re-Conomy Project is bringing this entrepreneurial kind of inventiveness, this creativeness into the network. And I think my belief is it's going to have a major impact on the network. So I've been working with that for the last 18 months, and it's immersed me in these new economic, you know, enterprises setting up. I started to see these trends appearing all over the place that I'm kind of engulfed in. And I felt like this discussion I want to have today is to try and put those in this tipping point kind of context. So having said all that, I'm actually no expert at all. You know, I don't come here with a 10, 20 year founding of something of major relevance, but I come here with some ideas, and hopefully with the collective wisdom of the group here, we can actually evolve those ideas slightly further forward. So, the first sleeping giant, to the chase. The first sleeping giant is cooperation. The cooperatives movement, as it were. Maybe you don't know this, but around 800 million people, nearly 1 billion people, work in cooperatives right now. And so they've got dependents, they've got children, adults. There's actually 3 billion people on the planet that are dependent upon cooperatives for their livelihoods. And I've seen a stat that shows that there's more people in cooperatives than there are in multinational corporations. So when we think about the economic model, we don't think of cooperatives as being such a major player. So I argue that the cooperative movement is a giant already. You know, the format of my talk is I'll say that feature of the economy is a giant. So cooperative movements is a giant. It's powerful in the quantity of billions of people that are engaged in it. And I'd like to argue that it's starting to wake up right now. This giant is starting to become more and more stirred because of 2 or 3 different reasons. The first reason is this just whole new innovation of ways of repackaging the cooperative movement. Has anybody got a new kind of spin on cooperatives? Can anybody tell me about a new spin on cooperatives?
I'll be coming here looking to, in some way, form therapeutic villages, which is a term that I'm using currently as a working hypothesis, to say we can use parts of the existing system, for example, the NHS, where there are managers on board, where there is enlightenment, the nurses are aware, they come to these festivals, they see what's happening, and people in mental hospitals respond better to coming to a festival like this than they do in hospitals. They exhibit wellness behaviours instead of illness behaviours, and if we can find some way of that being self-supporting, then it's a win-win situation.
So you see maybe the patients would be
Patient and staff would be incorporated.
incorporated into it.
And like at this festival, this festival is a sort of miniature of a therapeutic village, and that if we could draw people in to finance through existing structures such as the NHS, let the managers work in the system, recruit nurses, train them, bring them.
Brilliant, but that's a slightly different issue. Yeah, we're moving into the content of your enterprise rather than the way of it being a cooperative. But brilliant stuff. Okay, go on. Energy box. Energy bonds. Brilliant. Which is, and there's the Industrial Providence Societies. Is that a kind of adaptation of the energy bond? Of this? Well, but I'm not really too worried about these definitions, because for me cooperation can go into collaboration, you know, and it's rather than that competitive corporate structure, we're looking at this much broader kind of collaborative, cooperative. So that would fit fine. I'm quite happy with this broader definition. Yeah. Any others? Yeah.
Yeah. As I understand it, Sunrise is actually, its business constitution is a community interest company.
Brilliant.
Now, with community interest companies, as I understand it, please correct me if I've got it wrong, you can actually write your own constitution under a generalised heading. And in general, there are multiple forms of cooperative-like business structures to set up with. So they're there already, and you can add
in your kind of terms or whatever it is.
Yes.
In the Constitution, absolutely.
Could I just add to what Julian was saying over there? We're still trying, but we didn't get our land for a community farm going back a couple of years. But we had a partner in the project, and that was called the Vanessa Project. It runs out of Mind, the mental health charity, and the woman that you'd need to speak to is called Alison Haywood. Now, the point of my saying that is it resonates very much with what you're saying. That project was oversubscribed because what it did very simply was to take clients, people with psychiatric, psychological problems, out to do people's gardens who couldn't do their own garden. And what we wanted to do with the farm project was to actually expand that into people working with animals and growing again.
So it sounds like you guys could possibly have a connection worth making here, and so I suggest that if you could make that connection, you know, at some point. So I'm going to take this on track for a second here, and thank you for that. There's so many different forms that are coming out. Another one is, for example, community ownership of pubs or shops is on the rise. There's different kind of the asset transfer process where communities can, you know, old public buildings like the town hall that's no longer financially viable, people are taking those on board. Community ownership of forests, so, you know, there's 500,000 acres in Scotland that are in community ownership now. So there's this real renaissance of different ways of taking on board a kind of old form of cooperative kind of models. But the bit that's starting to really stir up the kind of the pot, as it were, and making quite an old format into something really refreshing is the open source movement online, and things like Wikipedia, and now the and WordPress, and those ways of collaborating. What has happened with things like Wikipedia is they burst this bubble. People have realised that cooperating is far more powerful than the Britannica encyclopedia could ever achieve, and so there's been this there's been this shift in understanding. We've got a new story now that says actually cooperating is a powerful means of efficiently delivering great services, products, or whatever. And what's happening really very interesting with the kind of open source movement online is it's starting to seep offline. all of that, those techniques and those innovations of ways of collaborating are starting to seep off light. So I know Ed Dowling here was part of the Good for Nothing events. If you don't know what they are, they're essentially a bunch of people come together and they pick 2 or 3 projects and they just throw their expertise at those projects for 2 days and collaborate to kind of launch those projects forward. And so, you know, there's just so many of these different ways that we're deciding we can work together to deliver things, to deliver change. The open source ecology group, which is an amazingly innovating kind of collaboration. It works in the kind of open source movement, and what they've done is they've decided there's 50 machines that we need to survive, and they're trying to find the cheapest and most efficient kind of way of building them, so they're flexible, you can rebuild them, you can have the plans, you know, it's a tractor or a printer, or all these kind of things that society needs to kind of keep going forwards. And they're making them in these hugely versatile ways, and then making the plans available, and they're making them collaboratively. People are kind of throwing in ideas, and it's just throwing upside down the old model of corporate kind of make something, sell it, make money, throw it away, that kind of stuff. So, I put it to you, my hypothesis is that the cooperation movement is both a giant, it's huge, and it's stirring and it's awakening, and it may well be crossing a tipping point where it will create this economic shift. Now, what I want you to all do is stand up, remember where your seats are. If you're feeling cold, you can have a jig if you want. And I want to ask you, if you believe what I've just said, yeah, if you believe that the cooperative movement and its new forms and its new kind of awakening could potentially impact the world economy in such a way that it's never again the same, I want you to kind of stand towards the left. If you're not completely convinced, don't stand all the way over on the wall. And then conversely, if you're not convinced this is a sleeping giant, I want you to kind of stand on the right-hand side. And then if you're not sure, stand square in the middle. My left, sorry. My left. Yeah, well, good point. Brilliant. Okay, so that's the first time I've ever done that, and I'm tremendously excited that we have a whole bunch of people that believe that there's an economic shift on the horizon. So what I want to do is just for a few minutes, and I'll ask you to keep your points brief, but I want to bring everybody in and ask you, when is the tipping point? So please come back into your seats. If you want to think about that, when is the tipping point? When will the cooperative movement go past the point of no return? Go into that kind of hyperdrive of runaway positive change. Any thoughts on that? When is the tipping point? In 5 years' time. And do you know a reason for the tipping point, or is it just a feeling that that's a good time? Brilliant. Brilliant. Really good, and I'm going to do. I did it at the beginning. I'm not sure if you was here, but there's a really important part of the tipping point. There's different stages to a giant awakening. So we talked about the fact that 350 parts per million, actually 400 parts per million, would be a tipping point for climate change. And then there'd be a period of time. It would take a lapse of maybe 2 years, but we'd hit 2-degree temperature rise. And then the permafrost will melt, and then the huge quantity of methane will still take another 30 years before it has climate impacts on the ground, where we're having runaway kind of mad climate responses. So the tipping point can be a very silent whisper moment in our history. I was talking to Dan earlier. Previously in something that he was reading, he said most people during the Renaissance didn't know the Renaissance was happening. It was only afterwards they looked, wow, that was what that was all about. And so the tipping point doesn't necessarily have to be a major boom event. What I want to do is feel it, see if we can pinpoint those quite subtle tipping points.
Is it something about people exchanging, just feeling more confident without going, oh, I've got to be paid for this, or and it just starts and more people do it.
Do you know what? I would say that's probably the biggest tipping point of them all. I think that's probably the biggest sleeping giant. Because once we reach a trust point, which doesn't exist, and I think that's the kind of the meta tipping point that we need to get past. But I'm thinking of other ones, yes, as well as that. But that's yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's going to trigger other things as well.
It related to that, sort of begs the question from who. Because if you look in Greece, for example, you can say that the tipping point has been reached. They're setting up lots of new trading solutions and ways of collaborating and building trust between each other and sharing and looking after each other.
Yeah.
So I think a good tipping point for Europe might be when Spain leads
Goes.
the euro as well.
So I love that. I love that because it brings in a saying that I really like, and that is, the future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed. And so there's different places where the future is already happening, essentially. Any more tipping points? Okay, so I don't have the ownership of the truth, but my gut feeling is the moment where Wikipedia and things like that burst our bubble, I think that was a silent tipping point where we believed in the power of cooperation. And then that may have other major events will come out there. So my gut feeling is, what I propose is we cross that tipping point, and actually we're already in a process of runaway positive change. And the crux of the matter is the race is on, essentially, because the negative tipping points are very close. Yeah, so I'm going to go on to the next sleeping giant. Yes.
It's a ripple on the pond.
Yes.
It's not a wave.
But that's it. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. There's very subtle things happening now, like in the Renaissance where we couldn't see it, type thing. But when that ripple hits that 3 billion people, which are dependent on the cooperative movement already, and that kind of infrastructure that already exists for the cooperative movement, then the wave comes in. Then the very visible moments start to appear. Okay, so I'm going to move on to another giant, and I'm kind of enthused by the fact that we just collectively said that we could be, there's a sleeping giant, we believe it could happen. So I'm really enthused by that. The second sleeping giant is the growth profit paradigm coming to an end. Okay? So there's a couple of reasons why that paradigm is starting to awaken. And we talked about it here where there's the economic collapse. And essentially, the growth economy is reaching certain limits, as you're probably acutely aware. I'll go through a couple of them right now just to bring it into the dialogue. But so on one hand, we have the kind of the growth paradigm starting to collapse. But on the other hand, there is a massive upsurge in more than profit businesses. So the cooperation movement is just the kind of bedrock of that, or one of those elements, but then charity sector and the social enterprise sector, they're all, all of these kind of in-betweens that are starting to appear that mix charity and social enterprise are another huge element in this kind of more than profit activities. I'm going to show a video. Has anybody seen, I don't know how well it's going to work, has anybody seen Paul Hawking doing his 5-minute bit about what it was, kind of Mother Earth's response to, I'm going to play it anyway. Hopefully it's going to work. Volume LinkedIn. He is really inspiring. I mean, can you see, is that really bad quality anyway and we should just bypass it?
I can't see a thing.
Can't see it, right? But it's actually what he says is kind of important. Yeah.
Well, you read his lips.
Yeah. I should know it off by heart. I've seen it enough times. But it's funny because this worked. We tried this out and it worked. And we said, great, that's sound. We even had a little listen. Okay, it's not a major issue. He's truly inspirational in this talk, and I know other people like myself that just listen to this and let it wash over them.
Where do you find this talk?
It was part of the Pioneers conference, and I think if you just key in Paul Hawking and the Blessed Unrest, then you'll get this video.
For different economic sectors, cultures.
Yeah, that was it.
No exception. It has many roots, but primarily the origins are indigenous culture, the environment, and social justice movements. Those three sectors. And
let it wash over you, because this is
it is my belief that we are part of a movement that is greater and deeper and broader than we ourselves know or can know. It flies under the radar of the media by and large. It is nonviolent. It is grassroots. It has no cluster bombs, no armies, and no helicopters. It has no central ideology. A male vertebrate is not in charge. This unnamed movement, you can clap for that, the unnamed movement is the most diverse movement the world has ever seen. The very word movement, I think, is too small to describe it. No one started its worldview. No one is in charge of it. There is no orthodoxy. It is global, classless, unquenchable, and tireless. The shared understanding is arising spontaneously from different economic sectors, cultures, regions, and cohorts. It is growing and spreading worldwide, with no exception. It has many roots, but primarily the origins are indigenous culture, the environment, and social justice movements. Those three sectors and their subsectors are intertwining, morphing, enlarging. This is no longer or simply about resources or infractions or injustice. This is fundamentally a civil rights movement, a human rights movement. This is a democracy movement. It is the coming world. What you're seeing here is the beginning of a list of the 130,000 minimum organizations in the world who work towards social and environmental justice. And that's a minimum. It may be 250,000 groups, it may be 500,000 groups. Read these names. They're unfamiliar to you, most of them, I'm sure, right? They are. We do not know how big this movement is. It's marked by kinship and community and symbiosis. It is Pachamama. It's Mama, right? It's the earth talking back, waking up, you know. What you see is your kin on that screen, you know. And to give you a sense of how big this movement is, if I had started this tape on Friday morning at 9 a.m. when this conference began, and if we sat here all day Friday, all night Friday, all day Saturday, all night Saturday, all day Sunday, all night tonight, and all day Monday, we still would not have seen the names of all the groups in the world who we are.
Okay, I wanted to stop it right there. It's that magical feeling that there's these thousands, hundreds of thousands of groups all over the world that are kind of under the surface. And this beautiful idea that that list could just go on for days and days and days and days. And that's really, a part of this more than profit kind of entities, organizations. And so there is a real kind of awakening of these entities. So on one side, you've got this really positive upsurge of new entities appearing to say that we're not interested in profit, we've got something else to do much more important. And then on the other side, you've got this kind of reaching of limits. So I'm going to just go through peak oil a little bit, and I'm going to try and put a different spin on it because I think you guys are probably going to know quite a lot about it. But essentially, since the Second World War, the economic growth has tracked the production of oil. More supply of oil has equated to an equivalent growth of the economy. And there's slides with that I've got on this, but I'm not going to show you because they don't really work. There's loads of stuff. I've got these slides that show before every single major recession since the Second World War, there's been a spike in oil prices. And that's how impactful the kind of oil is woven into our economic structure. And only 12 months ago, the price of oil crossed the $100 barrel mark. And I said to my entire family, I said, that's the cutoff point. When it goes over $100 a barrel, the economy can't stand that anymore. And so this is one of nature's limits to the economic growth. And there's quite a few others that we can go down that route. So we've got this balance between the end of economic growth and then also the profit driver as being a key driver for many organisations. The cooperative movement, the kind of social justice and environmental movement, all of these entities have a more than profit kind of structure. So I've suggested that this is a giant, not least because there's hundreds of thousands of people and because it's a giant because economic growth impacts on us all across the globe. And I've suggested it's starting to stir and it's starting to awaken both for limits to growth and because people are awakening essentially to try and do good stuff. And so this giant is starting to wake up in my mind. I'd like you to stand up. And I would like to ask you to do the same thing. If you think this is a sleeping giant that's awakening and it would or could have a complete shift change impact on our economy, I'd like you to head over to that side and vice versa. Okay, brilliant, brilliant. Again, I'm hoping this is a theme, and I think we can't underestimate the collective importance of us all looking around the room and saying, actually, it's more than just me that believes that this shift is potentially on the horizon. To collectively stand there and say, we all agree that this is happening. This is something that's real. I think that's a very important moment for us all. So come back to your seats, and I think there's a quite clear tipping point with the limits to growth for this. But is there any more tipping points that people can bring into this in terms of what's going to make this, release this giant and completely awaken the giant? Peak everything, absolutely. I'm with you on that.
And there's the positive feedback loop of the methane in the permafrost melting, that's very going to be a positive.
Which is the negative kind of stuff that we're racing against almost, isn't it? That's the race is on. And my gut feeling on that, sorry, no, let's go with the tipping points, yeah.
Yeah, I think that for a few years now, people have had doubts, but they haven't really known how to voice them. It's like somebody was saying, or a few people have been saying here, about them. They won't let it happen, they won't. But very ordinary people, if there is such a thing, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just across the board. Yesterday, or the day before, for example, I went down to drive the bus into town and I got chatting with a woman at the bus stop. She had a couple of kids in one of those big prams, and I can't remember how we engaged in this conversation, but I spoke about what I was doing and what it was about, the ethos underlying all this transition, and not too much so. And she came out with a statistic. Now, maybe somebody here can tell me if this is right or not. But it's the fact that she came out with this statistic. And she was
the so-called ordinary person in the street.
The so-called ordinary person in the street with a couple of little kids in a pram waiting for a bus. I'm just using this as an example because it's just a couple of days ago. Well, she came out with a statistic that 2.6% of this country is actually, only 2.6% of this country is covered with buildings. Now I don't know, and development.
Right, okay.
I don't know if that's
Like a,
exact or true, or you know, she missed a point out there somewhere, because I told other people, and they said, oh, it's got to be, you know, it's got to be 26%. But it doesn't matter, right or wrong. You know, people are really looking at. The problem is, and I think where the movement to where this tipping point will express itself, I agree with you. I think it's happened in people's minds. They just need the means by which to express that.
to articulate it. I'm with you on that completely. Sorry, there was a lady. Do you still want to have a?
I don't know whether this arrives as a sort of economic tipping point, but my work and the passion that I have in my life is for supporting people in emotional states of change. And what I've noticed over the last 10 years is the types of people who are coming for support, therapeutic support, spiritual support, that type of thing. The demographic is changing. Ordinarily have thought this person works high up in a corporation or something like that. You might have a judgment about how they live. They feel pain like anyone else feels pain. They feel confusion like anyone else feels confusion. And as fewer and fewer things make sense to the rational mind, more people are starting to acknowledge emotional unrest within themselves.
Yeah.
And as those people start feeling that that's not no longer suppressible, you can't just continue taking the drugs indefinitely, they turn to the inner world. And to me that's a tipping point corner, you know, where more people in pain, more people in confusion, more people looking for solutions, and they might not know about, you know, environmental or global factors per se.
But they're asking the questions.
But they're asking the questions, and that's, for me, that's a tipping point issue.
Brilliant. Okay. And then we've got one more at the back as well. No, sorry, this is Chapel Hills first. I'm confusing you.
I find it quite amusing when you talk peak oil, because the critical is peak food. You can turn on a pump on an oil well. The Saudis, if the oil price goes up, you turn the pumps on, you pump out more expensive oil.
Yeah, make more
food
money.
In this country, if you plant wheat, you've got to plant it 10 months before you harvest it. You can't suddenly think, oh, we're short of wheat today, you know, in November, or we're actually be about June, July, because it's just before harvest. And so you can't suddenly go and create wheat from nothing. You cannot create food from nothing. You can pump oil any day. You'll have a bit less tomorrow, but you can defer the problem. You can't defer the problem with food.
No, I agree with you completely. And yeah, the gentleman mentioned peak everything, and I think you're absolutely right. If I had enough time, I would say learning that we can't, you know, we don't have enough to feed ourselves. That we're running out of time with our ability to, with our food system, would be another sleeping giant. But I just don't have time to add that one into it. But sorry.
It's interesting to think that when the television was first released, it took 50 years for it to make it into all the homes, and mobile phones, they made it in 20 years into general hands. Then iPods took 3 years. The internet has spread, and I'm a training midwife, and I can send out a feed about what's going on, for example, about a midwife in Hungary who's under house arrest for doing what she does, for supporting her community. And that feed goes global, and within 5 minutes, 60,000 people have seen that feed, from Australia to Canada to Uganda, and that takes 5 minutes. It's not 50 years anymore. Things are here, and they've arrived, and my profession is not the same anymore. I read books about midwives in the 30s who felt alone in their beliefs, who felt isolated by their communities, who felt that they couldn't reach out, that no one was hearing them. Now, I receive emails from a midwife in the mountains of Guatemala, and she tells me about what's going on in her community, and that feed gets sent out across the globe, and women everywhere, again, everywhere, reading the information that I received from this woman in Guatemala.
That's amazing. I just want to say that I'm letting that wash over me completely, because I started, or wash into me, and kind of taking all that on board, because I started by saying that some of these reactions can take 30 years to feed through into the system. And so you reminded me of that kind of contraction of time. And so I can be a little bit more excited now by the fact that actually, you know, the big events of systemic change could be coming much quicker than I was initially thinking. So I'm taking that in, and yeah, I'm going to be holding that with me.
Can I just say what that lady just said is a tipping point? Can I say what the lady just said? When we have that immediacy of response, when we can inform people on such a scale so quickly, then that is a tipping point, and we need to take ownership of that technology, as is already happening, as with Julian Assange, my namesake. And it's the beauty of the movement. We have to work with the technology. We can't be Luddites anymore. But it's just wonderful to hear what you just said.
Brilliant, yeah.
And to know we cannot act collectively together, you know, so rapidly, whether it's in terms of political demonstrations or just informing one another about what the next forum is, where to meet, and organise ourselves more efficiently through it.
So we can all take away the fact that these tipping points have happened. You know, it's just how long is it going to take to feed through is the question. But I think we should all, you know, take away whatever resonates with us, that these tipping points are not necessarily future events. Some of these tipping points are past events.
How big a factor do you think the power that corporations have, though? Because for these tipping points to really take full effect, and for there to be some kind of power shift that you're talking about, there has to be some kind of power loss from the corporations that are currently so strong. And at the moment, I don't really see that happening. If anything, corporations are becoming more and more powerful.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. Let me see if the next section goes into that a little bit more. I think it does to a certain extent, but just the idea of crowdfunding or crowdsourcing, or the fact that Wikipedia can do it without any kind of, the fact that we can bypass our institutions, we can bypass the corporations, the foundations that those power structures exist on are now slowly degrading. So I would say that their time has come, essentially, but it's not, you know, the growth in power is actually still happening for multinationals, but in parallel, the growth in the degradation of their foundations is also happening at the same time. So, okay, I'm going to move on to the next one. It's the last one. I'm going to try and finish in about 10 minutes' time, around 2:45, to give the next person time to set up. So I'm going to try and do this reasonably quickly, but the next sleeping giant that I want to introduce to you is the DIY culture. And that's not the handyman type thing, but the kind of idea that we shift the balance between being consumers to being producers. And so off-grid, quite clearly, you know, producing its own energy, producing, you know, the whole ethos of off-grid is a huge shift in consumer to consumer-producer kind of balance. The neighbourhood that I live in is a housing estate with 1,000 houses, and we produce nothing. You know, it's a dormitory of consumers. But what I'm suggesting is there is this kind of shift towards being consumer producers. And the reason that this is a giant, and it's not a niche idea just destined to be an off-grid festival, is because if you go to any one of the BRIC nations or to Africa, if you go to Brazil, Russia, India, China, you'll find that in the hinterland, everybody is a consumer producer. So the majority world don't live that kind of linear consumption thing that we do right now. The majority world are actually already producing and consuming their stuff. Now, my wife's Brazilian. I spend a lot of time in Brazil. And when we go to her town, nearly half the town are in her family. And there's this steady stream of people turning up with a blanket that they've made or a jewelry box that they've built. And so there's two things going on. One is it's beautiful that they have that connection to be able to make their own, manufacture their own goods and crafts and things, but also they're looking aspirationally to the West and saying, I want to be like you guys. and so that's deteriorating at the moment, but it exists. That foundation, that giant, which is the DIY culture, is very prevalent in the kind of emerging markets, as they're called. And also you're seeing this wave, this upsurge in the West, or the richer nations who had lost that connection with their goods are now starting to return to connect to those. So you see it in the allotment numbers. You know, 20 years ago they were selling off allotments, now they're oversubscribed. You see it in the kind of the fact that more energy producing technologies are going up all over the place, maybe not as fast as we'd like, but all these different kinds of things are starting to happen where people are actually producing stuff rather than just consuming it. And there's that upsurge. What I want to kind of introduce is the way that we're doing in the West is full of new technologies as well. So the idea of just going to your allotment now has permaculture on top of it. We're not just going back 50 years and deciding we're gonna, you know, it's not a regressive step, the idea that we become producers. We're bringing new techniques into this, vertical growing. You know, we're getting these huge yields out of really kind of nice and diverse systems. And so what I'm saying is the West are kind of returning to this, or the rich nations are returning to becoming producers, but there's also this wonderful mix of kind of innovation in amongst that. So another one of the kind of innovations is the media, the fact that we can produce a book, a film, or a website, a blog, or anything. The fact that we have the power to the previous speaker was saying about self-producing music. You know, the fact that we can make these kind of mediums without the power structures, for example. We don't need those power structures now to publish our own book, and so we can do that ourselves. And so my argument is that this is a giant. Let me make sure I've covered all the reasons. There's a couple of other things that are going on with this. Not only is it do it yourself, when you bring in this kind of wave of cooperation and collaboration, it's starting to become do it ourselves. So people are starting to do this on a community level, where you see things like tool sharing or repair cafes. I don't know if you've seen these kind of repair cafes where people meet up and they just repair things. You know, there's one in London called the Restart Project, where people come together and they try and get all their electronic goods together, and then they try and make it work again. And so do it yourself, mixed with the cooperation and the collaboration movement, becomes do it ourselves. And so there's these new kind of twists to the old kind of the thing that we used to do ourselves is actually evolving into something completely new. Things like peer-to-peer funding that we were talking about, crowdfunding, the fact that we don't need those institutions, we can do it collectively ourselves, also brings into this new kind of mix. So this is a giant because the BRIC nations, the rest of the world, are already doing it. It's starting to stir, it's starting to awaken, because these new things coming in, the corporations coming in, and the West is starting to get revitalized around these ideas, and not least because we're getting revitalized because we believe we have to maybe survive, and whatever the reasons are, the richer nations are starting to do it. So once again, those are my rationale, and I'd like us to stand up for the final time. And if you feel that this is a sleeping giant that's awakening and it's got the power to change systemically our economic system, head over to the left. If you think it's mediocre and it's not going to quite hit it, stand in the middle. Or if you're not sure, stand in the middle. If you disagree, then head over to the right-hand side.
Sorry, could you say that?
If you think that the kind of the rise of the DIY culture is a sleeping giant that could possibly impact systemic change to our economy, then head over to the left. So that's interesting. I think there's a less of a real definition here, and I think partly I believe that as well. The other first two are slightly more stark in the fact that we're reaching tipping points. This one's slightly more kind of there's less of a stirring going on.
Yeah, but with this, what this actually involves is relationships that into account. I've got 4 hens.
Come on back to your seats, guys, yeah.
I've got 4 hens, and my neighbour was quite excited when I said that I was thinking about getting hens. I was really thinking, you know, what are they going to think about it? Because they're bound to escape every now and then.
Make noise, maybe.
Yeah, make noise, and anyway, there was a fence panel down between our 2 gardens, and I got on very well with these people. They were very nice to me, although I didn't know them. I was quite ill when I was in hospital, and they brought me food. And then I gave them some vegetables, and finally I said, look, you know, just don't put the fence up.
Leave it open.
Keep it open. And I've got a situation where Cynthia, she's called, climbs over the wall, and she's looking after the hens now.
Oh, lovely.
And you know, there's this reciprocal thing that goes on, which is difficult to value, but it's powerful.
So I want to bring in what the lady said earlier about trust. And so I think the new economy is built on trust and relationships, and that's a great thing. You know, that's a really positive thing. And yeah, there's a major tipping point. I'm seeing with the festival, for example, with off-grid. Dan's going to give a talk later on about, you know, I think at the end of an era, beginning of a new era, and there's a real discussion about how could this festival be much more kind of embody the new economy. It already is a pioneer of the new economy. It already is a microcosm of the new economy. But what's the next step? And so there's talk about it being free. I don't know if that's something that Dan is actually like behind the idea, but the idea that everyone just brings stuff and contributes stuff. And that's built on this huge amount of trust that people are going to turn up. They're not going to abuse that kind of system. And I think once you cross that threshold into that trust that that's going to work and that people can have those relationships together, I think you're going to open up a whole new economy, yeah. And it's really disruptive, but I'm not sure the role of off-grid, for example, is to get that message, it's to set a precedent. Off-grid hasn't got the power to get that message out all across the world, but it can set a precedent that people can take on board. So that's basically it. We've spent a good hour, and I hope we've used it productively. I hope we've had some kind of tipping points in our brain and our belief systems where we can walk away from today and say, you know, maybe I can't articulate it perfectly, but somewhere deep down I've started to believe that there's a shift happening, and there's some logical reasons for that shift. Thank you.